Psychology in Seattle.
So, Berto, I want to talk with you today about something that's quite personal to you, I think.
Okay.
Which is about your attachment style, your attachment injuries, and also how that might have led to addictive behavior or, substance use problems, spending compulsions,
Sure.
other kinds of things. Because I think that in our society and even in the clinical world, they don't acknowledge enough the link between attachment injury, attachment issues with what we might call addictive behavior. What do you say?
Sounds deep and painful.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. This episode is just going to be for patrons of the podcast, but first I have a little bit of intro here to talk about, and I'll have you introduce yourself again later, Humberto, or for the first time later. So addiction, according to research, mounds of research, addiction is absolutely associated with insecure attachment. So insecure attachment is when you're mistreated in some way, either through being abandoned as a child or abused as a child, or even if as a child you had loving parents, but they just had a lot on their plate. Maybe they were depressed. Maybe they worked a lot. Maybe there were too many kids in the house, which led to you getting a little neglect. You had loving parents. You always knew your parents loved you, but they just didn't have enough resources to go around, so to speak. So that's another deceptive mistreatment that can happen to people. So as a result of that, people will grow up with what we call insecure attachment, where people will feel as though they have a chronic feeling of loneliness or hurt or pain, of being rejected or just having to rely on themselves or something. And they also walk around with low self-esteem sometimes, or they feel bad about other people, and they have a hard time trusting other people. They have a hard time reaching out to other people when they're hurting. They have a hard time really internalizing good relationships because they're always a little wary or they're distorted in how they see things. And this compounds the problem, right? Because as they go into adulthood and they exhibit these sensitivities that cause their relationships to not be so great, then they extend the period of time in which they have not so secure relationships. Whereas when you're raised without mistreatment and you have secure attachment and you grow up into adulthood, because you generally trust people, you generally know how to find people that are good for you, then into your 20s, into your 30s, you have even more good relationships that are secure and mutually gratifying.
And that kind of builds on itself.
Right. And so the idea goes is that, research has found that insecure attached people as adults tend to have more addictions, more compulsive behavior. One study by Karimi et al., 2018, found that insecure attachment increases the risk of addiction by 40%.
Jeez.
That's a lot. So there are other things, obviously drug abuse, internet addiction, gambling, this kind of thing, lots of research. Every client that I've worked with who had substance issues or addictive issues had significant attachment issues.
Oh, wow.
Early in life, abandonment, abuse, or just general neglect. So, but in today's episode, I really want to talk about why that link is there, and I want to go over your life as an example of that. Is that okay with you?
That sounds very useful to me.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Who are you, Humberto?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I am a honeycomb repair person.
This episode is only for patrons of the podcast. So if you're not a patron of the podcast, this episode is going to end before the content begins. If you want to hear the full episode, you have to go to patreon.com and become a patron of our podcast. And when you do so, you'll get instructions on how to access this episode and hundreds of other premium episodes, which are arguably our best episodes. They're only available to patrons of the podcast by going to patreon.com. Do so now. Do it, do it, do it.